Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I always enjoy speaking at the Heritage Foundation, especially because it means that I get to spend time with the scholars, the thinkers, and the doers here who have dedicated their lives to the noble cause of freedom and have made this sort of the heart, the capital of American conservatism. Or as Donald Trump calls you here at Heritage, the people with the ties with bells on them. We meet this morning at an anxious time for the Republican Party, and indeed an anxious time for our country. Some of you might joke that every day is an anxious time for America, or at least for the Republican Party. But it's different now after the wild, raucous 2016 election cycle. Washington Republicans today find themselves in a strange moment in history, enjoying overwhelming political power, and yet beset to a certain degree by strategic confusion. Normally, this is where a conservative like me might ding party leaders for their lack of courage or their lack of vision. But in fairness, after 2016, Republican leaders have good reason to be confused. Their problem is not that they lack vision. They have a vision, and it was roundly rejected by both parties in last year's presidential campaign. And it must be said, that rejection applied to many parts of the Republican policy status quo that conservatives have always supported. Donald Trump did not run for president on his celebrity or on his personality, although they certainly helped in both instances. He ran for president directly attacking Washington Republicans in terms that not only matched but were much harsher than those ever used by Tea Party movement conservatives. He trashed President Bush's vision of Iraq. He trashed the conceit of comprehensive immigration reform as it was attempted in 2013. He trashed free trade deals that he argued surrendered American jobs and sovereignty to enrich global elites. He trashed Republican orthodoxy on issues once considered beyond debate in many circles. Donald Trump's tabloid and reality TV persona may be an artifact of America's glib celebrity culture, but his presidency represents a substantive indictment of Washington's political and policy-making consensus, very much including much of the consensus that exists within the GOP itself. And it's a criticism that I've made myself. 7 years ago, I ran for the Senate as an anti-establishment challenger against a three-term incumbent from my own party. 4 years ago, I first came to the Heritage Foundation and urged conservatives to reconnect with working families and struggling communities that our party had far too long ignored. And I spent the bulk of my first term in the Senate advocating for policy reforms to help and empower the forgotten Americans that Washington's broken status quo seems increasingly and chronically to be leaving behind. President Trump's peculiar brand of populist nationalist politics is not exactly what I had in mind. But nor must his election be the existential threat to conservatism, republicanism, and constitutionalism that many of his critics on the right tend to fear. It certainly represents a challenge, but it's up to us to decide whether that challenge is really a threat or whether it instead might better be understood as a real opportunity, one that we should take advantage of. Anti-establishment conservatives, moderate and establishment Republicans, and the new populists President Trump has brought into our coalition must now find a way to work together and to govern. Conservatives may not support everything this coalition does. And when we don't, we should say so. We should make that clear. But we are part of it now. And within it, I believe conservatives can thrive. We can thrive, that is, if we do what we do best, and if we do it well, if we do it consciously, and if we do it with the right plan in mind. Now, the chief political weakness of conservatism tends to be its difficulty realizing when societal problems can and should be addressed through public policy, through government action of one form or another. Conservatives' view of human nature and of history tells us that in this life, there will always be problems. Those problems aren't going to go away. They will be there one way or another, and that attempts to use government to solve those problems often makes things worse rather than better, that the treatment can sometimes be as bad as or worse than the cure. This actually makes us good at finding solutions in many ways. At best, conservatives craft successful reforms by empowering citizens and communities to experiment with bottom-up, trial-and-error problem solving. That's what makes markets and civil society work. That's what markets do, and it's what civil society does. And it's why we trust both of those institutions. At our worst, though, we as conservatives tend to look indifferent to suffering and injustice because we may not see them for what they are, which are problems that require action on the part of government. But today, President Trump has already identified the problems that the American people want us to solve and that they desperately need us to solve. Economic dislocation and insecurity, inequality of opportunity, political marginalization, and social isolation. And, of course, the cruel repugnance of a well-connected elite, insulated from all of the above, openly contemptuous of their disconnected countrymen who are not. These problems are why Donald Trump ran for president. And these problems also explain why he won. Government didn't create these problems. They were mostly caused by larger forces beyond the realm of public policy, things like globalization, technology, and changing social and moral attitudes. But what government has failed to do is see that to tens of millions of Americans, these forces have not been welcomed as exciting innovations of progress. They've been endured, rather, as attacks on their lives and on their livelihoods. President Trump was elected to help those Americans. He was elected, in many respects, by those Americans. And conservatives, especially conservatives who had misgivings about candidate Trump, have a duty now to help him see how and where our principles can help serve his mandate. While the left rages and the Washington establishment scratches its head, we as conservatives can make a case for a unifying, principled, and populist agenda that puts the federal government back on the side of the forgotten Americans, that restores the bonds of trust, civility, and solidarity on which our national happiness depends, and that reforms policy to put American workers first again, in the world, in Washington, and in their own hometowns. Let's start with the world and the challenge of American workers in the global economy. Capitalism, broadly defined and properly understood, works by aligning the interests of people who might otherwise be adversaries, buyers and sellers, lenders and borrowers, etc. In particular, and in necessarily oversimplified terms, capitalism brings together the proverbial rich people with money to invest and not rich people who have labor to sell. They form cooperative, profitable partnerships that help each other, help their families, help their countries, and ultimately help the world. It's a win-win. Globalization merely extends capitalism beyond natural borders, beyond national borders, beyond the borders of one's own country. This opens up new opportunities, but it also puts a new twist on those rich, not rich partnerships. Financial centers like New York City are still funding business ventures, more than ever, in fact. It's just that today, a lot of investments that used to flow to places like Michigan or Arkansas now flow to places like India and China. You see the twist. Pre-global capitalism mostly brought together rich and non-rich people from the same country. Today, however, global capitalism increasingly brings together rich people from rich countries and not rich people from not rich countries. This has made both better off than ever before. But who gets left out of that bargain? The not rich workers in rich countries, in particular, the American middle class. You don't have to believe in conspiracy theories, and you don't have to ignore other larger factors like automation and developments in technology to see how globalization all by itself can leave America's workers behind. The natural forces of global capitalism, especially those billions of people in poor countries desperate to work their way out of poverty, tend to expand investment opportunities for affluent elites while narrowing work opportunities for non-elites in places like the United States. The temptation, both on the right and on the left, is to try to resist those natural forces. First to ignore them, then to resist them. But public policy cannot pick a fight with human nature and hope to win. The Wright brothers did not fight the laws of gravity and aerodynamics in order to fly. They instead used them. They harnessed them to their own benefit. In the same way, whenever we can, policymakers should embrace human nature and harness human nature to society's ends so that everyone benefits as a result of what they can produce. The way to put Americans first is not to fight against the global economy, but to put it to work for the American people, to put it to work specifically for the American worker. A simple but powerful two-step federal tax reform would go a long way toward accomplishing precisely this goal. First, we should eliminate the federal corporate tax altogether. And then we should raise the rates on investment income, dividends, and capital gains to treat it like ordinary income. This would accomplish three things. First, it would liberate the worker's share of the corporate tax. Economists differ on the precise ratio, but the consensus is that lost wages make up between 1/4 and 1/2, or sometimes even more, of corporate tax revenue. Whatever the proportion, we know that eliminating workers' share of that tax would redirect billions of dollars from the IRS into workers' paychecks in every industry across the country. Second, it would level the playing field between American workers on the one hand and American investors on the other hand. In a pre-global national economy, it made sense for the federal government to tax investment income at special low rates on the logical assumption that dividends and capital gains would be reinvested somewhere in the United States, even if somewhere else than where they originated, somewhere in the United States. But in a global economy where American investors' best returns might be found on the other side of the world, that logic doesn't necessarily hold any longer. Globalization has been disproportionately beneficial to American investors compared to American workers. The tax code should not unfairly compound that inequity. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this new tax framework would actually tilt the playing field in the global economy in favor of the United States. Rather than compete against foreign tax havens, the United States would become the world's tax haven. For foreign investors, this tax reform would be an offer they couldn't refuse. Zero tax on profits produced by American-based companies and jobs. And even for American investors, this framework would offer a better deal than they could get anywhere else, and I mean anywhere else. Today, the United States' 35% corporate tax rate, 20% rate on capital gains and dividends, and 3.8% Medicare surtax add up to a 50% real top federal tax rate on investment income. After eliminating the corporate tax, we could raise tax rates on capital gains and dividends all the way up to the current top labor income rate of 39.6%, and investors could still come out ahead so long as they invest in the United States. Wealthy Americans would still be free to send their capital abroad. They would just have to start paying the same tax rates all other Americans pay. No more would they receive preferential incentives to create jobs in other countries. The specific rates, offsets, and other details can be worked out later, even, I think, in a bipartisan fashion. It's the structure of the policy that really matters here and that I want to emphasize today. Under this pro-growth, pro-worker framework, trillions of dollars of foreign and domestic investment could flood the American economy. And with workers' share of the corporate tax liberated by the zero rate, a greater portion of all this new investment and growth would be channeled straight into workers' paychecks. Suddenly, the United States would become the best place to do business, almost any kind of business, anywhere in the world. Overnight, the fastest and easiest way for global elites to make money would be to create productive, sustainable, middle-class jobs, and to do so right here in the United States. Now, this reform would serve President Trump's trade agenda as well. The zero corporate rate would turn the bad trade deals President Trump has decried on their heads. It would bring more of the global economy here rather than sending more of the American economy abroad, elsewhere in the world. Meanwhile, transferring workers' share of the corporate tax to investors would mean that the resulting economic growth would disproportionately be realized as new jobs and higher take-home pay. Economic growth would reach Main Street, and not just Wall Street and K Street. Rather than withdrawing from global trade, ideally, we should be looking for ways to benefit more from it. And under this framework, free trade would no longer be a mixed blessing of sorts. It would no longer be the mixed blessing that it sometimes has been perceived as by American workers. It would deliver economic protection without the protectionism. And unlike riskier strategies like border adjustment and tariffs, this pro-growth, pro-worker reform would work for all Americans, as consumers, as workers, and ultimately as empowered citizens. And President Trump could inaugurate this win-win for American workers by negotiating a brand new trade agreement with our brave friends in the post-Brexit United Kingdom. Just as we reform our tax and trade policies to put American workers first, our broken immigration system calls out for the same. Immigration provides real and tangible benefits both to the immigrants who come here and to those of us who were born here, but that's only half the story. Like any policy, America's immigration status quo has trade-offs that policymakers have ignored for far too long. Harvard economist George Borjas estimates that the net increase in total wealth from immigration for those born into the United States is about $50 billion per year. Unfortunately, not only is that $50 billion not distributed evenly, but Borjas also estimates that roughly $500 billion per year is transferred from immigration's losers to immigration's winners, thanks to our government's current immigration policies. Not surprisingly, it's the same working families and communities being left behind by globalization that are being squeezed by competition from low-skilled immigration. Reform, in short, is long overdue in this area. There is no silver bullet, no single easy solution to this problem. No one comprehensive plan will balance everything and everyone out. But there are some small things we can do on the margins to begin to level the playing field for the Americans who have been on the losing end of current trade-offs. Now, the President has begun work on a border wall and other enforcement measures to help reduce illegal immigration. My colleague, Senator Tom Cotton, has suggested limiting legal immigration to nuclear and not extended families. That would help. Reorienting our entire immigration system around economic need, reducing low-skilled inflows, and recruiting more high-skilled immigrants to help start up businesses and new jobs would help too. Coupled with pro-worker tax reform, pro-worker immigration reform, would further raise wages and open new opportunities for struggling Americans who have quite simply been ignored for far too long. If the first part of a new conservatism for the forgotten man is the agenda to put Americans first in the world, the next parts must put Americans first in Washington and in their hometowns. In coming months, I'll be working on additional projects and policies to accomplish those tasks. Part of the reason why working Americans have been left behind is that they've been cut out of the governing of their own country. Too many decisions are being made in Washington, D.C., and too often by unelected bureaucrats who unaccountably impose their values on communities and people they've never met, imposing their will from a distant perch while not accountable to those who are subject to the laws they create. Reasserting federalism is more than a constitutional principle. As we look around our increasingly divided national community, policymakers must do whatever we can to lower the temperature of our politics. As centralizing more power in Washington, as presidents of both parties have done for far too long, and justifying it with self-serving platitudes about compassion, about who we are, or the right side of history, obviously hasn't worked. The only thing that will work is embracing the principle of subsidiarity and sending non-national decisions out into our diverse society, where different communities can experiment with different ideas about how best to meet their own unique challenges, according to their own necessarily unique priorities. If Washington lets Vermonters run Vermont, and Utahns run Utah, New Yorkers run New York, all of the above will be happier for it. All of the above will be more prosperous for it, except maybe the Washington bureaucrats, but that, of course, is a feature, not a bug. The way to empower the forgotten Americans is to empower the local communities where they themselves can be in charge, where the forgotten Americans can exercise their own will in their own local self-government. This will allow more Americans to live according to their own values and rescue all Americans from the unnecessary traumas of an imperial president from the other party. Finally, after divesting Washington of policies better managed at the state and local level, conservatives should work to re-examine and reform what's left. Specifically, we should make sure remaining federal policies serve the interests of working Americans as opposed to the cronyist elitism we see today. Social Security and Medicare aren't going anywhere, so let's make sure they work best for working families. The federal government's role in national issues like telecommunications, higher education, and the management of federal lands should also be reevaluated to ensure policy is opening doors for the less fortunate, rather than closing them and then locking them. The federal government's role in national issues like telecommunications and higher education always needs to be under examination, and we shouldn't assume that because any issue is important, that it has to be an issue that is handled from Washington, D.C. The goal should be federal policies that empower citizens in their states and hometowns, markets, and civil society to cooperate and compromise, to work together eye to eye, rather than having the two parties locked in a national winner-take-all total war over every single issue, where every single issue has to be resolved ultimately in Washington, D.C., and where the more important the issue, the more steadfast people in Washington are that it has to be resolved only in Washington. Last year, mercifully, the American people put Washington on notice. They elevated not only Donald Trump, but Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz ahead of more establishment presidential candidates in both parties. The message from the left and from the right was clear. The status quo in Washington and around the country is not working. The status quo, defined by ever greater economic globalization and political centralization, is exacerbating the isolation and atomization of the American people. We cannot fix our broken status quo from the right or left by giving more power to the same government that has failed at so much for so long. I mean, look, over the last 80 years, we've given this centralizing government experiment a nice, long, hard college try. And it has failed us. It has divided us. It has made us less powerful. It has made us less upwardly mobile. And we have to get away from that approach. Our new president made this very point just a few weeks ago in his inaugural address when he said, quote, "Today, we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the American people," close quote. President Trump, with a new Congress eager to be led, has an unprecedented opportunity to fulfill this mandate. And our conservative principles of constitutionalism and localism, mixed with a healthy dose of the president's intuitive American nationalism, are perfectly suited to the task and to the moment. Together we can forge a new conservatism for the forgotten families of our republic, meet the challenge the American people have put before us, and, as the saying goes, make America greater than ever. Thank you very much.